In the sleepy, river-hugging town of Willow Creek, the world moved at a gentler pace. It was a place where the spring rains didn't just wet the pavement, they transformed the landscape into a watercolor painting, turning the gardens into chaotic, beautiful riots of violet wisteria and emerald ivy. Here, in a neighborhood where the oaks were older than the houses, lived Clara Mitchell. At 55, Clara possessed a beauty that she rarely acknowledged, a kind of quiet grace like a statue in a secluded garden. However, she had grown far too accustomed to the silence. It had been 5 long, stretching years since the love of her life, Arthur, had passed away from a sudden stroke. Their home, a sprawling Victorian with a wrap-around porch and turret windows, had once been the heartbeat of the street. It was a house built for noise, for dinner parties that went late into the night, for the clinking of wine glasses, and for the smooth, rhythmic sounds of jazz records spinning on the turntable. Now, however, the house felt less like a home and more like a museum of past joys. Dust motes danced in beams of light that no one walked through. To keep the crushing weight of the quiet at bay, Clara had constructed a fortress of routine. She filled her hours with meticulous pottery classes, her hands constantly coated in gray clay, shaping vessels that were empty, much like her days. And then there was her garden. She spent endless hours pruning her prize-winning roses, fiercely cutting back the thorns, trying to plaster over the silence with the sheer exhaustion of manual labor. But life, as it often does, has a way of interrupting our carefully constructed defenses. It happened on a damp Tuesday morning in late April. The rain was tapping a steady rhythm against the kitchen window. Clara was in the pantry, a narrow space smelling of dried basil and old wood. She was preparing a soup, simply for something to do, and needed the heavy porcelain tureen from the very top shelf. It was a piece Arthur had bought her in France, heavy and sentimental. She pulled over the old wooden step stool. It had been wobbly for years, one of those things Arthur had promised to fix and never got around to. As Clara stretched up on her tiptoes, her fingers just grazing the cool ceramic handle of the tureen, the world shifted. The stool's leg caught on an uneven floorboard. In a heartbeat, gravity took hold. There was no time to correct, no time to balance. She tumbled backward, a chaotic blur of flailing arms. The fall seemed to happen in slow motion, followed by a sickening crunch as she landed hard on the unforgiving quarry tile. The tureen shattered around her, but Clara didn't notice. A white-hot bolt of pain seared through her right knee and shot up her wrist. She cried out, a sharp, involuntary sound, but the high ceilings of the Victorian house simply swallowed her voice. She lay there for a moment, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, breathing through the shock. "Come on, Clara," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. She tried to move, but her leg refused to cooperate, sending fresh waves of nausea through her. Panic began to set in. The isolation she had cultivated suddenly felt like a prison. Thankfully, she had kept her phone in her apron pocket. With shaking fingers, she managed to dial. And because Willow Creek was the kind of town where neighbors still looked out for one another, Martha, a retired schoolteacher who lived next door, saw the ambulance lights flashing before Clara had even fully processed what had happened. Transported to Riverside General Hospital, Clara felt stripped of her dignity. The air smelled aggressively of antiseptic and industrial floor wax. Lying on the gurney in the hallway, clutching her purse to her chest, she felt incredibly small and fragile. The bustle of the emergency room moved around her, a river of scrubs and clipboards, leaving her stranded on an island of pain. That was when Dr. Julian Bennett walked into the room. He was a man who wore his 50 years well. He had salt and pepper hair that was perhaps a little too long for a doctor, and kind, crinkled eyes that seemed to hold a quiet humor. His presence immediately lowered the temperature of the room. He didn't rush. He didn't bark orders. He moved like calm water. "Mrs. Mitchell," he asked, checking the chart before meeting her eyes. "I'm Dr. Bennett. I hear you've had a disagreement with gravity." Clara managed a weak, watery smile. "The gravity won, I'm afraid." He stepped closer, pulling a stool up to the side of the gurney so he wasn't looming over her. As he began his examination, his hands were remarkably steady. He gently manipulated her swollen wrist, his fingers probing the bone with a touch that was professional yet surprisingly tender. When he moved to check the range of motion in her knee, his movements were precise, careful not to cause her more pain. For Clara, who hadn't been held, or touched, or cared for in such a direct way in years, the contact was disarming. It sparked a flicker of something long forgotten, a biological memory of being safe in someone else's hands. It was a warmth that had nothing to do with the sterile heat of the hospital room. "Well?" Julian said softly, looking at the X-rays that had been pulled up on the monitor. It looks like a severe sprain in the knee and a hairline fracture in the wrist. You did a thorough job. He turned back to her, his knee brushing against the sterile sheet covering her leg. It was a brief, accidental contact, but it felt surprisingly grounding to Clara. You're going to need rest, Clara, he said, using her first name with a familiarity that felt comforting rather than presumptuous. And I mean real rest. No pottery, no heavy lifting. They chatted while a nurse came in to prep a fiberglass splint for her wrist. Julian didn't leave immediately, which was unusual for an ER doctor. He seemed to be lingering. He noticed the dirt still embedded under her fingernails from her morning in the garden. You're a gardener, he asked. Roses, Clara explained, the pain in her wrist dulling slightly under the distraction of conversation. Heritage breeds. I was worried about the rain knocking the petals off the early blooms. Julian's face softened, a shadow passing through his eyes. My ex-wife, she used to love roses. Though, since the divorce, I've been left in charge of the garden. I'm afraid I'm a bit of a butcher when it comes to pruning. It's quieter work than I'd like. There was a shared frequency in that admission. In the busy hospital room, a silent understanding passed between them. They were two people who understood the specific, heavy weight of an empty house. Clara was discharged a few hours later with a heavy brace on her leg, a cast on her arm, and a pair of aluminum crutches. The days that followed were a lesson in frustration. The independence she prided herself on was stripped away. Friends dropped by with casseroles, soups, and sympathy, but they eventually went home to their families. The nights were long, and the silence in the Victorian house seemed to amplify. She spent hours sitting by the window, watching the rain and worrying about her garden turning into a jungle. She felt useless. 2 weeks later, she returned to the hospital for her follow-up appointment. She felt a flutter of nervousness she couldn't quite explain. When Dr. Bennett, Julian, walked into the exam room, her heart did a traitorous little skip, healing nicely. He murmured, his focus entirely on her wrist. He traced the area around the bone to check for tenderness. The exam felt different this time. The crisis of the accident had passed, leaving room for something else. The air between them hummed with an unspoken question. It was less clinical, more personal. He asked how she was managing the stairs. She asked if he had figured out his roses. As the appointment ended, he helped her down from the high exam table. He didn't just offer an arm, he placed his hand on her lower back to steady her. He held the position for just a second longer than was medically necessary. It was a stabilizing touch, firm and warm, that sent a jolt of electricity straight to Clara's heart. Julian cleared his throat, looking suddenly bashful, like a schoolboy rather than a seasoned physician. He took off his glasses and cleaned them, a nervous tick. You know, Clara. He started, looking at the floor and then back at her. I wasn't joking about being terrible at pruning those roses. I could really use an expert's advice. I was wondering if you might be willing to consult, maybe, over coffee. Clara looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the loneliness behind his kind eyes and the hope. She smiled, and it was the first genuine, glowing smile she'd worn in a decade. I'd love that, Julian. But I can't drive with this leg. Then I'll pick you up, he said, his grin matching hers. Coffee turned into dinner at a quiet Italian bistro by the river. Dinner turned into long, slow drives through the countryside as her leg healed. They found they had an effortless rhythm. Julian didn't just fix her bones, he seemed to know how to mend the fractured parts of her spirit. He told her about his passion for restoration architecture, how he loved saving old things that others had given up on. She shared her love for old vinyl records, and one evening, she finally worked up the courage to play him Arthur's favorite jazz album. They sat in her living room, listening to the saxophone weep, and for the first time, the memory didn't hurt. It just felt like a part of the tapestry. One stormy evening in late May, Julian drove her home after a physical therapy session. The sky had turned a bruised purple, and the rain was drumming a frantic, heavy rhythm on the roof of his sedan. He pulled into her driveway and rushed around to her side, opening the door and holding a large black umbrella high to shield her. He walked her up the steps to the porch, their bodies pressed close to avoid the deluge. At the front door, the atmosphere shifted. The sound of the rain felt distant, creating a curtain that separated them from the rest of the world. The only reality was the man standing before her, his coat damp, his eyes searching hers. Clara, he whispered, stepping into her personal space. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing away a stray raindrop. Do you have any idea what you've done? What have I done? She breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. You've made the quiet parts of my life sing again. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. When his lips met hers, it wasn't the fairy, reckless kiss of youth. It was soft, tentative, and overwhelmingly sweet. It tasted of rain and coffee and second chances. It was a kiss that contained a promise. Her hands found the lapels of his coat, pulling him closer, anchoring him to her as the thunder rolled in the distance. From that night on, the timeline of their lives merged. Julian became a fixture in the Victorian house. He made good on his promise to learn gardening. Under Clara's guidance, he learned the difference between a weed and a wildflower. He brought his tools over and finally fixed the wobbly pantry shelf that had caused the fall, reinforcing it so it would never shake again. They spent their evenings on the back patio, her leg propped up on his lap, his fingers interlaced with hers, watching the fireflies dance in the dusk. It wasn't a whirlwind romance. It was a mature, deep-rooted love. It was built on the comfort of his hand on her waist while they cooked pasta sauce from scratch, and the safety of her head resting on his shoulder while they read the Sunday paper. As autumn arrived, painting Willow Creek in shades of russet and gold, they took a trip to a cabin in the Highlands. It was a place Clara thought she'd never have the heart to visit again, as it held memories of her past life. But with Julian driving the winding roads, holding her hand across the center console, she realized something profound. They spent the weekend hiking slowly through the falling leaves and sitting by the lake, watching the reflection of the clouds. That evening, lying by the stone fireplace, wrapped in a thick wool blanket in each other's arms, Clara listened to the crackle of the wood. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full. It was peaceful. She looked at Julian, the firelight dancing across his face, and realized that she wasn't replacing her past. She wasn't forgetting Arthur. She was simply expanding her heart to make room for new joy. Clara's fall had broken a bone, and it had been terrifying and painful, but it had also shattered the walls she had built around herself. It had set her life on a path she never expected, leading her straight to the person who would help her stand tall again. From a moment of pain came the most beautiful, tender healing of all. And that is where we leave Clara and Julian, safe in the warmth of a new beginning, listening to the rain against the window, no longer afraid of the quiet. It serves as a gentle reminder to us all that even when we stumble, even when we fall and things seem broken, we might just be landing exactly where we are meant to be. We bring you tales of love, hope, and emotional journeys every single week. Until next time, keep your heart open to the unexpected.